All right, the Russian Constitution. It's really important to know, one, that Russia had a constitution in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. This constitution, the collapse of the Soviet Union, did not stick because of an ongoing conflict between Boris Yeltsin and the legislative branch. This image is an example of that conflict. In October 1993, the Duma refused again to approve Yeltsin's prime minister. He had fired four at that point. The Duma refused to approve the prime minister, and as per the Constitution, Yeltsin suspended parliament. The Duma refused to leave the building. The building was fired on by the military with missiles and tank shells. This constitutional crisis between the legislative and executive branches in October 1993 was resolved with the constitution that we now have in Russia, that has had a tendency to emphasize executive power over legislative power. Do remember, do not forget, Russia's constitution guarantees freedoms of speech, press, assembly, fair trials, and human rights. Please do not say that Russians do not have these freedoms. They are there on paper. Russians do have the freedoms. However, because there's an authoritarian regime, that authoritarian regime under Vladimir Putin takes those freedoms, oppresses the Russian people, and is breaking the Constitution. This is the Putin's regime ignoring rule of law, which again, you need to remember the definition of rule of law as the principle that in democratic systems of government, all aspects of a constitution, all laws in a country apply to the government and the people. That means the government can be held responsible for its actions based on whatever the Constitution says. Whenever this gets disrupted and a government is not held accountable, or a government acts and overrides the Constitution outside of the checks and balances that exist in the Constitution, we are ignoring rule of law. And that's what's happening in Russia. So the executive, as of 2.5 years ago, 2021, the Constitution was changed in Russia officially. This is the third change when it comes to the executive. And currently, the president of Russia can serve 2 consecutive 6-year terms. That is starting from this next election, which is actually next week, here in March 2024. If Putin is elected, and it looks like he's going to be, he will then be elected from 2024 until 2030. And if he's re-elected after that, could be in power as long as until 2036. We'll walk through this next week about how the guidelines about the presidency have changed in terms of when it comes to terms, because that does mirror some of the issues that have happened in Mexico. It's really important, I'm going to repeat, that you continue to keep in mind for the rest of the year, one, what are aspects of all executives or all legislative bodies or all judiciaries that all of them can do in almost any country, regardless of regime, democratic or authoritarian. And second, what is unique to just the particular country that we're studying at the time or comparing. Okay, and as I walk through this, I'm going to highlight some of those comparisons, similarities, or special parts for Russia, and also mention other countries like the United Kingdom, Mexico, Nigeria, so that you are hearing the comparisons and can come back to this as we cover material for the rest of the year. So The president of Russia can choose and dismiss the prime minister. That is unique to the semi-presidential system in Russia. In no other countries in the Big Six can a president dismiss a prime minister. That is only Russia, because only Russia has a semi-presidential system of the Big Six. We did learn earlier in the year about Poland briefly because they had an election, if you remember that. Poland is also semi-presidential. Most Eastern European countries are. This, the cabinet, is a power that executives have in general in any country. President Xi Jinping has the standing committee. That's his cabinet. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom has a cabinet, all from the Conservative Party that he leads. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the president of Mexico, has a cabinet he's selected. The president of Nigeria has a cabinet. The president of Iran has a cabinet. This is something that's universal, okay? So keep that in mind. Doesn't matter if it's an authoritarian regime or a democratic one. Something unique to Russia, the 8 federal districts, the big territories. We'll look at a map later in the week. Those big territories, those 8 federal districts, have governors. And those governors and many of the governors of different republics or subunits, what we would call states. So sometimes they're called republics, sometimes they're called, they have other names in Russian, okay? Those governors are sometimes appointed by Putin, sometimes they're elected. The super districts, those 8 super districts are not elected, they are appointed. And many mayors are also appointed by Putin. That is unique to Russia. Goal, lots of local oversight, lots of executives watching over what happens in these local areas. Now, it is possible to argue, well, that's authoritarianism. That's a lot of authoritarian control in the hands of one person. Putin's argument that he made in the early 2000s for doing this was actually about increasing people's access in subunits, these territories, to getting government support, help, and funding, which, folks, is the way that an executive branch is supposed to work. It happens in our country when it comes to departments in the cabinet. You have power in the executive to better distribute budget money and funds and implement policy. Okay, so the initial intent was not put forward as authoritarian. The action was something that could happen in a democracy. But because of the way that Putin has built on that, we have led to authoritarianism. Something that any executive can do for the most part, propose bills. And do that in Russia. Veto bills. That veto exists in the other Big Six countries that we'll talk about. And also remember that the UK doesn't have a veto. We'll talk about that when we circle back to the UK here in a couple of weeks. This is something unique to Russia, and that is the concept of presidential decrees. Presidential decrees are an executive power that, one, shows a lot of power being concentrated in the hands of the president, who's head of state, and 2, the possibility for authoritarianism developing in Russia. Because if you can issue an a presidential decree that from the outset, this is why they're so powerful in Russia, are assumed to already be constitutional. In other words, the constitutional court is not going to question the presidential decree. That means that the executive can take an action just like the Duma passing a law with the Federation Council. It just doesn't involve the legislative branch at all. Okay, so this is important. We'll have to watch next week. That's where the election happens. Remember, right now, Putin is really the only viable candidate at this point. Opposition candidates have either been disempowered, jailed, or in the case of Alexei Navalny, have unfortunately passed on. And we don't have people running against Vladimir Putin who are going to be strong candidates at all. Things that the Kremlin, which is how the executive branch is referred to in Russia, it's like saying the White House in the United States, foreign and defense and interior ministries. Folks, interior ministries is going to deal with things like resource distribution, but also sometimes issues of immigration. Armed forces. President Putin is the commander-in-chief, even though he is the head of state. Okay. The Federal Security Service, or FSB, which is the current Russian government's extension of the former KGB. Really important to keep in mind that the president of Russia can be impeached. This is something that takes place in Mexico. The president can be impeached. Nigeria, the president can be impeached, but it is a complicated, difficult process. Keep in mind that the prime minister in a parliamentary system can also be removed from power, but it is much quicker because it can just take a simple vote of no confidence, a simple vote of, do we support this leader or not? And that vote of no confidence can happen within the party because the prime minister leads the biggest party in parliament, or it can happen with all of parliament voting, which means that the prime minister's own party might vote against him or her. Okay, that is much more expedient than a presidential system that has impeachment. But if we want to have checks and balances, that's why it takes more time. Okay, legislative branch, referred to as the Federal Assembly. It's like saying Parliament in the United Kingdom, even though Parliament is the House of Lords and the House of Commons. It is similar to saying Congress in Mexico, even though Mexico has a Senate and a Chamber of Deputies. It is similar to saying Congress in Nigeria, even though Nigeria is bicameral and has a Senate and a House of Representatives. Okay, the entire legislative branch is referred to as the Federal Assembly. This legislative branch, though, has asymmetric bicameralism. Okay, and it is, we do want to describe this as a parliament. All right, this is asymmetric bicameralism. Asymmetric because the Duma is larger and has more power than the Federation Council. This is like the United Kingdom. Remember this, folks, as a comparison. The United Kingdom, the lower house, the House of Commons, is more powerful, has more influence than the House of Lords, the upper house in Parliament. House of Lords does have more people than the House of Commons, but most of those lords and ladies and barons and baronesses don't actually show up for any of the meetings that they have in Parliament. So their roles are symbolic. Okay, House of Lords far more ceremonial than it is actually substantive. Lower house, and I mentioned this in class, if you weren't there, from here on in, folks, you need to know numbers, just like it was important for you to know the numbers when we learned about the parts of the Chinese one-party state. you need to know the numbers of how many people are in each legislative body or part of the legislative branch. It's 450 members of the Duma. Members serve for 5-year terms. Okay. That is different than in Mexico, which we'll talk about very soon. In Mexico, at the lower house, the Chamber of Deputies serves 3-year terms. In Nigeria, in the lower house, that term of office is 3 years as well. Elections are a mix of single member district and proportional representation. Don't get too worked up about knowing the difference between the two if you're confused by them, although we talked a lot about single member district. Okay, at the beginning of the year, it means each district has one person representing it and everybody votes for one person for that district. Okay, that's like the US House of Representatives. That's like Parliament. But the Duma now mixes it up and has proportional representation as well. This is just like Mexico. It's an important comparison between the two. Biggest reason, and we'll come back to it, is in Mexico, where there was a one-party dominant state for 70 years. One party dominated and controlled the government. And we had a very authoritarian government at times. Has actually changed its legislative branch, made constitutional amendments, and this mix of single member district and proportional led to executive power being taken away from the president, and that party that had lots of power and control losing that power and control. The opposite has happened in Russia, because Russia has changed from 1993 having single member district and proportional to then having proportional only when it comes to elections, and now switching back to single member district and proportional for the Duma. Okay, that has led to one party dominance, the United Russia, and a party that is very deferential to Vladimir Putin. Okay, we'll talk more about this when we compare the two countries together. If you were in class, this is your preview. If you were in class, this is your preview. Powers that the Duma has. The Duma can initiate legislation. The Duma can accept or reject legislation. And that legislation can be proposed by the executive, or it can come from the Federation Council. The Duma can also override a president's veto with a 2/3 vote. Okay, that's important to keep in mind, that it's a 2/3 vote, because that's the check on the executive. That veto override exists in Mexico, it exists in Nigeria, and we'll talk about how it plays out in those countries too. It's an important place of comparison. This is unique to Russia, because we don't have a prime minister in Mexico. It's a presidential system only. We don't have a prime minister in Nigeria. It is a presidential system only. Unique to Russia, in Russia, the prime minister is appointed, or nominated rather, nominated by the president, but put into power and appointed by the Duma. But, and this goes back to that 1993 conflict between Yeltsin and the Duma. They did put it in the Constitution that the Duma can be dissolved. That means they either are going to need to have elections or meet to find a way to resolve their problems, but they can't exist as a parliament anymore until they have new elections, basically. If they refuse the president's prime minister choice 3 times, that has not happened at all since President Vladimir Putin has been in power. But it is important to keep in mind that it is intended Here we have democratic norms on paper. It is intended as a check within the semi-presidential system, but functionally it hasn't taken place. Federation Council is the upper house of the legislative branch, 170 seats. Half of those 170 seats are selected by governors of the various federal districts, republics, and other subsections of the federal system in Russia. The other half are selected by regional legislatures. Okay, remember that the governors, many of the governors, especially the super districts, are selected by the president. Other governors who are directly elected, Chechnya directly elects its governor, but that election is heavily influenced by Putin's choice and support. Terms, this is unique to Russia. The upper house in Mexico, 6-year terms for the Senate. That's what it says in the Constitution. Same thing, regardless of what state you're from. Nigeria, fixed terms as well. Not the case in Russia, where the term in the Federation Council will vary based on what region that person is from and what that territory's representation laws are. This is, again, intended to increase diversity. It's intended to support different regions in Russia being able to make their own choices. However, when governors are heavily influenced by Vladimir Putin's choices as president, when legislative branches are controlled by United Russia, who supports President Putin, it means that these territories are going to have guidelines that mirror more what the executive wants in Russia as its goal. Powers that the Federation Council has, the Federation Council can approve taxation and budget. Folks, this is something that happens in many legislative branches, okay? It happens in all the bicameral legislatures that we'll talk about. It will just be a question as we move forward through the rest of the year, where the bill for the taxation or where the bill for the budget starts, okay? In Russia, starts in the Duma. In Parliament, it starts in the House of Commons. Then the upper house in both has to still approve. And a rejection of anything that the Federation Council has put forward can happen with a 2/3 vote of the Duma. 2/3 of the Duma says no. The Federation Council's decision does not move forward. We do not have that in the United States. That is asymmetric federalism. Okay, this is asymmetric I'm sorry, not asymmetric federalism, asymmetric bicameralism. Okay. The judicial branch. This is unique to Russia, that Russia has a constitutional court only focused on constitutional issues. The Supreme Court is the last court of appeal for any criminal cases. So a case about Alexei Navalny's civil rights being violated in the Constitution, that case can make its way to the Constitutional Court. A case about Alexei Navalny's imprisonment being unfair, unjust, too harsh, that goes to the Supreme Court because it's about a crime with Alexei Navalny having been accused of corruption. So the Constitutional Court is the court that addresses any issues related to the Constitution. That involves things like treaties that Russia makes with other countries. The Constitutional Court reviews them, resolves conflicts between legislative and executive branches or between different regions, republics, or territories. Issues related to civil rights, like I mentioned with Alexei Navalny, Alexei Navalny's lawyers attempted to bring cases to the Constitutional Court multiple times about the ways that he was being treated, arrested, oppressed, or otherwise imprisoned unfairly from their perspective. The Constitutional Court, however, disagreed and said that it was okay. All right, this is the Supreme Court, or the Constitutional Court's, I said Supreme Court a second ago, I apologize. This is the Constitutional Court's power to do this, okay? Again, the Supreme Court in Russia focuses on issues of constitution now. It focuses on issues not related to constitutionality, but focuses on issues related to last court of appeal for a crime that someone has committed. Presidential impeachment is the other area that the Constitutional Court functions and focuses on in Russia. This is going to be similar to Nigeria. In Nigeria, its Supreme Court that has judicial review is involved in the impeachment process. Need to know numbers: 19 justices on the Constitutional Court. They are all nominated by Putin and then approved by the Federation Council. And remember that the Federation Council is fairly weak, acts as a rubber stamp for pretty much any policies put forward by the president. That means that the Constitutional Court justices are more or less completely in support of Vladimir Putin.